Thank you very much for inviting me here, and apologies that I'm addressing you in English. I did just, when I was sitting there, I suddenly remembered I did once do a Swedish course, a short one, but nothing seems to have stuck. So, yeah. I'm very pleased to be talking to you about, at this commission, my brief was, as Boo said, to talk a bit about the international experience. Now, I'm not assuming that you all know who we are, so I have got one slide on the International Energy Agency, just to put things into context. So we were founded in 1974, oil crisis. We're an agency of the OECD. Now, we've got 29 member states, but we are going through quite a lot of change at the moment. And I think what's important is that we certainly used to be seen as the agency of the rich countries, the developed countries. And, you know, if you look at most of our members, they are. Our latest member is Estonia, for example, it's number 29. But we do have countries like Turkey in there, and importantly, Mexico has just applied to become one of our member states. We have 3 new associate countries as well, so we're working with China, Indonesia, Thailand. And there are discussions with other countries like Brazil and South Africa. So we're very much expanding, and we're looking beyond, you know, Europe and the United States. And as Boo said, we are in Paris. There's about 240 of us. Now, what do? We advise those member states, and we do a lot of market and policy analysis. And here are 2 recent publications on which I'm drawing with a lot of the charts. So we do this renewable energy market report every year. We do one on energy efficiency. We also do, you know, oil and gas and all this, but I'm focusing on, obviously, clean energy options. One other thing we do is we look at our member states. And every 5 years, we do an in-depth country review. And our last one of Sweden was in 2013. Now, what did we find? We found that you are one of the leading IEA member countries in terms of low carbon intensity and renewable energy. So for me, it feels quite strange coming to Stockholm. In English, we have this odd saying, teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, which is kind of, you know, you assume your grandmother probably knows more than you, and you're trying to teach her something. And it feels a little bit like this coming to you in Sweden. When I worked in the United Kingdom advising the government, we would often refer to Sweden. We would look at you, for example, about your deployment of heat pumps or district heating or energy efficiency, and we thought, well, fantastic, you know, if only we could be so good. But as the minister said, there are still very big challenges. And in our last review in 2013, for example, we found that great to 2020 and you're achieving your targets. I think you're ahead of your targets. But the big challenge is to do those really deep reductions to 2030 to 2050. And actually, you're not alone with those. I found the same in the United Kingdom. We were doing well to 2020, but it's the very deep cuts to really trying to do things like energy efficiency in buildings and industry. You know, yes, everything is pretty good here, but it needs to be even better. Industry is still very energy intensive. Need to move away from the high carbon fuels to low carbon fuels, biomass, etc., and have even greater energy efficiency. A challenge we identified as well is obviously you've got old nuclear capacity. How do you replace that? With low carbon sources. And then finally, transport decarbonisation. And again, this is the very same challenge, I would say, almost across the world. We are still very hooked on our petrol-driven cars. Well, as you all know, we try to move into diesel because it's more efficient. We've now found that's causing huge problems with air pollution. Electric vehicles still have their challenges. Biofuels, we have all sorts of issues around sustainability. So none of this is easy. Okay, so just looking then across the world, what is it we at the IEA feel can be learned? And again, nothing is straightforward. But I'll start with renewable electricity, because that's in a way the success story globally. And I'll then move on to renewable heat and energy efficiency. And I'll mention transport as well. Okay, I mean, don't worry too much about the detail if you can't see all of it. I think the key thing here is it's a very clear upward trend. So since 2005, that's 10 years, we've seen globally a huge increase in in renewable electricity production. So we've got terawatt hours on the left side, and then we've got percentage of electricity production. Upward trend, obviously huge change in countries like China, which in global terms makes all the difference. I mean, whatever we do in small countries like here doesn't change the global picture very much, but China does. So the other thing, of course, you notice, hydropower is still increasing globally, mainly because of developing countries, but the big difference is what's happening with the additional capacity of wind power. Offshore wind, onshore wind, a bit as well on solar PV keeps growing. And why has that been? It's because there are support policies. This hasn't come about because of the market. Renewables are still more expensive, especially when you compare it to gas and coal, where of course, most countries don't have carbon taxes. Most countries do not take into account external costs. So you have to support those technologies. And we found in our latest assessment that 144 countries around the world have renewable electricity targets. That's really important. And almost all of them have renewable energy support policies. And they're all quite different kinds of policies, but to us, this is has been the key driver of the upward trend. And this has actually then also stimulated a reduction in price. So what this one shows is that the line that goes up is actually the capacity of solar PV, and then the other lines is basically the costs coming down. So policy support has driven the reduction in cost. I think a lot of you will know about the solar picture and how that's decreased. Which also means that in your policy, you always have to be on your toes, because otherwise you end up, because if you're subsidizing your technologies, the cost comes down, suddenly you are paying far too much. That's something we've seen in countries like Germany and the UK, for example, that some people have made a lot of money out of it because the policies weren't adjusted quickly enough as the prices came down. Now, this is a very complicated picture, and you don't need to worry about it too much, but this is something where we put on one chart policies in I think that's most of our member countries, plus a few others like Brazil, and China and Russia is on there as well. So different types of policy support mechanisms for renewable electricity, like here you've got your tradable green certificates. Other countries like Germany have feed-in tariff programs, then there's other things as well. So we've sort of got different colors. What we try to show with this, though, is that, I mean, obviously, ideally what you want is a policy that's low cost to the consumer and high impact. Well, actually, as you can see, that would be right at the top of the left side of the chart. There's actually nothing we found that's really high impact and really low cost. But we've got quite a few policies which are high impact and sort of medium cost. There are quite a few green things there, the feed-in program, but you know, some of the others creep in as well, a red one, which is tradable green certificate. And then if you look on the right side, the high-cost policies and low impact, well, you know, one of the feed-in programs is very low impact, and one of the tradable green certificates is low impact. So our point with doing this thing, and this is a few years old, but it won't have changed very much, is that it's not straightforward. You can't just say, oh, feed-in programs are all great. A lot of it depends, obviously, on the country, on the potential, on the overall regulatory framework. So as much as we'd like to say, well, one size fits all, it doesn't actually. So our conclusions on the renewable electricity policy side, just looking across the world in our analysis, is that one of the most important things, and I come back to that, is clear and credible targets. As I said, 144 countries have those. Here in the EU, there is no doubt that the Renewable Energy Directive, with the clear individual country targets, has absolutely driven renewable electricity policy, and to some extent, renewable heat and transport as well. And those targets have to be short, medium, and long term. Obviously, you have to have adequate remuneration, enough money for people to invest. And then, as I said, you have to adjust it. You have to have some certainty as well. And there is a bit of a trade-off. You need to adjust, but people need certainty. And, you know, in many countries, we've found there needs to be some kind of market intervention to de-risk the finance. I mean, we need the private sector funding, but government can help often with concessional financing. So that's what's happened so far. But then looking forward, you know, we do have a huge challenge to go forward. And we find, especially here in Europe, actually, there is now a lot of policy uncertainty. So we have a 2030 renewable energy target for the EU as a whole, but unlike the previous target, it hasn't actually been divided up, so we don't know what individual member states at the moment are supposed to achieve or are prepared to achieve. That means for the market, the investors out there, they're not entirely sure what's happening. We have some countries like the UK, but also other countries like Spain, continuously adjusting their policies downwards, so that's a big problem. One of the big challenges now, and I know you are doing lots of good things there in Sweden, is as we go beyond, you know, just 10, 20% renewables, they are variable renewables, so we need to think about how does that get integrated in our often old creaking electricity grids. We have electricity markets that are not designed for those kind of renewables. They are designed for, you know, a lot of base load. I was in Switzerland recently where they're finding it difficult to invest in pump storage stations, even though they play an absolutely crucial role in helping variable renewables, because no one at the moment wants to pay for it, because renewables like solar have actually driven wholesale costs down. So that makes investment in those longer term options difficult. And it all gets very complicated because it's not just about electricity supply side anymore. What's really important as well is what role can electric vehicles play? You know, they can effectively be part of your storage because you can charge them up at night. Heat pumps as well are a good option. And demand side response. You know, we can actually switch people's fridges off. We can switch, some companies can, in a short term, respond to demand questions. So we need new electricity market design, and I haven't got the final solution for you because I think every country finds that difficult. And then non-economic barriers, let's not forget those. And I've got another rather complicated diagram because that allows me also to move on to my other two areas, and that's heat and energy efficiency. It's not just about the economics, and it's not just even about technical barriers. I don't know about Sweden specifically, but we're finding in some countries quite a lot of public opposition to various renewable projects. We're finding, so if we move to things like renewable heat, you know, people are quite used to their nice gas boilers, might not want to switch to things like heat pumps, which work differently. And energy efficiency, if you're looking at deep retrofits in homes, they're very disruptive. So there are a whole load of barriers. So talking more then about renewable heat and energy efficiency, which I mentioned before, you know, those are some of the big challenges here in Sweden as well. Actually, there is a very good picture again on energy efficiency. I mean, this almost looks better than the renewable electricity one, if you like. So this is the avoided consumption through energy efficiency investments. Basically, we saved a lot of energy across the IEA countries, starting from the 1990s on this graph, and we've done particularly well in the last, say, 10 years So, like increased renewable electricity, we've improved energy efficiency a lot. So that's excellent. If we look at renewable heat, though, so what we include here are things like geothermal, solar thermal, bioenergy. We haven't included heat pumps in this one because they're slightly different technology, but there isn't actually an upwards picture at all. It's stayed fairly flat. So on energy efficiency, similar to renewable electricity, we've had a lot of policies. Most countries will have some kind of support policy, from building standards to here in the EU, of course, we've now got all the minimum efficiency standards for appliances, for lighting. That's really made a difference. On renewable heat, though, we're definitely behind. We have 40 countries across the world who have some kind of renewable heat support policy. Well, that's 100 fewer than for renewable electricity. We've got a particular challenge at the moment. Still a lot of heating is done through oil, so whether that's buildings or, of course, oil in industry as well. And we've got very low oil prices at the moment. And, for example, we recently looked at Austria, where biomass heating was really doing very well, but people have now stopped, or a lot fewer people are buying biomass pellet boilers and sticking with their oil heating because it's actually very cheap. So what are the policy lessons we found globally on energy efficiency and heat? Well, as I said, there are many examples of successful regulations, and we have done pretty well, I think, across the EU, especially on electricity appliance standards. They're excellent. But there is a big challenge of retrofitting buildings. And I think, you see that in cities like Stockholm or Paris or whatever. Of course, we can do a lot with, say, district heating systems, but some of the old buildings are quite hard to insulate really well. Of course, you can do insulation, better windows, but to actually get to the really low energy standards, it's difficult and it's very expensive. We said in our review of Sweden in 2013 that enforcement of standards and quality control is something you need to pay attention to. I think that's, again, something we find in many countries, that the standards are in place, but does it actually get checked? You need to have very good builders to get very high standards of energy efficiency, and that's not happening all the time. On renewable heat, it's a much, much more difficult sector than renewable electricity. It's much easier to say, okay, we need solar PV on roofs, we need, I don't know how many gigawatts of wind farms, whereas here we've got lots of individual homeowners needing to make choices, industries which maybe have easier options. So that it's not easy to regulate. You need to think about local approaches, heat mapping and planning, where I know, again, Sweden has probably done a lot of this. We need a lot more combined heat and power to make, for example, district heating very efficient. Need to definitely think more about heat and energy efficiency together. These are not separate things, and I've seen that in the UK, for example, in the energy department. Well, here's the heat people, here's the energy efficiency people. Probably could work much better together, and maybe you do that already, but then also you need to think about there's buildings, there is industry. We need to think about the sectors and how they can be done. So I come back to the targets, though. I said for renewable electricity, those long-term targets really have driven the deployment. Now, in the EU, the member states have refused to agree on proper long-term targets for energy efficiency. I mean, there's the Energy Efficiency Directive, and part of the package for 2030 is energy efficiency. But we've never had the same kind of agreement where we knew, well, by 2030 we're going to need to get that kind of reduction in energy efficiency. So I would say there's probably some lessons to be learned from that, because if you have your targets and your very focused policies to achieve those targets, certainly on the electricity side, that has been very successful. Okay, so then to conclude, and just to repeat some of those themes, renewable electricity, there is a lot of policy risk. We do need stability and long-term targets, and I would say every EU country now needs to come up with the 2030 targets to get clarity for investors. Policies need to think about the market and regulatory framework. I don't know enough about your Swedish electricity market, but you need to think about how you can integrate even higher rates of variable renewables. Electricity market designs, renewable heat and electricity, certainly we need a lot more policy attention to this. We need to have renewable heat strategies, renewable heat targets, and policies to achieve those, and this integrated approach. I think, you need to have a kind of, people love the word roadmap. Well, where do you need to be with your building stock in 2030, in 2050? Where does industry have to be by then? I haven't had much time to talk about transport, but this is another area where there hasn't been a lot of progress, there hasn't been enough policy support. Advanced biofuels is going to be absolutely key, and we're not very far along this road. And electric vehicles, of course, are part of the story. Now, just to finish off with a quote then, I was at a talk at the OECD just 2 days ago by the Canadian author Naomi Klein, which some of you, I'm sure, have heard of. And she was very good. And I liked the quote she gave, which basically said, we need a policy arsenal. So don't think just, one simple policy is enough. You really need to think about all the sector, about integrating policies. And, we are in uncharted territories. There is a big challenge here. We're going into the climate convention in Paris next week. I think we need to realize that this isn't an easy journey, but we know we need to get there because, hottest year on record, this is a serious challenge. And I wish Sweden every luck to get there. Thanks.